She was the woman nobody wanted at their table. Too heavy, too quiet, too strange, always crouching by the creek, filling her apron with weeds nobody recognized. When the beetles came and stripped every farm bare in less than a week, the valley had exactly two choices: swallow their pride or starve. Most of them chose pride first. This is the story of Maeve Callahan, the woman an entire frontier mocked, threatened, and almost destroyed, and how she fed them anyway. If this story moves you, like and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this travels. Redbriar Crossing, Autumn, 1887. The creek didn't care what people thought of her. That was the thing Maeve Callahan had figured out by the time she turned 27. The water ran cold and clear regardless. The wild chickweed kept sprouting along the muddy banks whether anyone valued it or not. The elderberries clustered heavy on their branches every September without asking permission from anybody in Redbriar Crossing. So Maeve kept coming back. She came back with her woven basket, her thick ankles sinking slightly into the soft mud, her breathing heavier than she liked after the long walk down from the ridge. She came back even when she heard the whispers that followed her through the settlement like a bad smell. There goes the Mercer woman, off collecting her weeds again. Lord knows what she does with them. She came back because the creek was the only place in Redbriar Crossing where nobody looked at her like she was a problem that needed solving. It was a small settlement, maybe 60 families scattered across a valley ringed by dark hills. Not the kind of place that made it onto any important map. The kind of place where everybody knew the exact weight of your failures and kept a running account. Maeve's account was long. She didn't grow corn like Eleanor Ames, who could harvest 300 bushels and still find time to sew matching curtains for her windows. She didn't pickle enough to fill a root cellar the way the Voss women did, turning it into something close to a competition each August. She didn't even keep a proper kitchen garden, which was, according to most of Redbriar Crossing, the absolute minimum a wife was expected to manage. What she did instead, what she had been doing since she was a girl, was walk. She walked the creek banks and the tree lines. She walked the north slope, where the soil turned dark and damp, and strange fungi grew in patterns she had slowly learned to read. She walked with her eyes close to the ground, stopping to rub a leaf between her fingers and smell it, tasting the tip of a stem, pressing her thumbnail into bark to check the moisture beneath. It was slow work, quiet work, invisible work, the way most necessary things are. "You're going again." It wasn't a question. Silas said it the way he said most things to her lately, not with cruelty, but with a flatness that was somehow worse. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she came down that Tuesday morning, already dressed for the fields, his coffee cup empty and waiting. Silas Mercer was a decent man by any measure, big-shouldered, patient, honest in his dealings. He had married Maeve 8 years ago because he thought her unusual and interesting. Somewhere in those 8 years, unusual and interesting had quietly become a source of private embarrassment. "I'll be back before noon," she said. "People ask me things." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Walt Ames asked me yesterday how you were getting on, and I could tell by his face what he meant by it." "What did you say?" "I said you were fine." "And?" He looked at his empty cup. "And nothing. I said you were fine." She picked up her basket. "I'll be back before noon, Silas." She heard him exhale behind her as she pulled the door shut. It wasn't a sigh exactly, more like something being carefully put down. But down at the creek, she was different. Not lighter, not transformed in any magical sense. She still had sore knees, and she still sweated more than she was comfortable with, and she still had the same brain that never quite stopped turning over problems. But she moved with more authority by the water. She knew what she was doing there. She crouched beside a stand of purslane, growing fat and green along the creek's edge, and pinched off a stem between her fingers. Good. Thick with moisture. She filled a section of her basket, working methodically. It was while she was moving further upstream that she noticed the frogs. Or rather, didn't notice them. She stopped walking, stood still, listened. 3 weeks ago, this particular stretch had been loud with them in the early morning, the way it always was by late September, that low rhythmic croaking layered over the water sounds. Now there was nothing. Not quiet, because she'd startled them nothing, just nothing. An absence that had a shape to it. She turned slowly, scanning the banks. No movement in the shallows. She looked at the stands of cattail along the opposite bank, undisturbed. No birds working the mud for insects. She looked up and realized she hadn't heard a single crow since she'd come down the hill, and this part of the valley always had crows. She stayed very still for a long time. Then she set her basket down and started paying a different kind of attention. She came home with a purslane and 3 other things: a knot of wild garlic, a bundle of dried lamb's quarters she'd found higher up the bank, and a specific type of uneasiness that had been sitting behind her breastbone since the creek. She didn't mention it to Silas. She went to her shelf, the one he tactfully pretended not to see. The shelf with its rows of dried bundles and small sealed jars, and her battered notebook filled with cramped handwriting. She flipped to a section near the back and started writing down what she hadn't seen that morning. Frogs? None. September 23rd. Checked both banks from the oak bend to the split stone. No sign of the usual colony. Birds? No crows, no red-winged blackbirds. 1 sparrow, moving fast, west direction. Weeds along upper bank. Untouched. The pigweed that the deer usually crop every week is still standing. Deer haven't been down to drink here recently either. She tapped her pen against the page. When she was a child, her grandmother, a woman who had survived a famine by knowing which bark you could boil into something edible, had told her one thing that stuck. The land always tells you what's coming. You just have to get quiet enough to hear it and brave enough to believe what you hear. What the land was telling Maeve right now was something she didn't want to be right about. She started preparing the following day, quietly, without explanation. She expanded what she'd already been doing, gathering and drying more aggressively, storing carefully in their root cellar in sealed clay jars. She mapped 3 new stretches of creek bank she'd been meaning to scout, noting what was growing where and in what quantities. She dug up a section behind the house and started replanting lamb's quarters and chickweed, the kind of thing nobody would notice or recognize as intentional. "You're digging back there again," Silas observed one evening. "Yep." "Maeve, I know what I'm doing, Silas." He ate his supper without further comment. That was the thing about Silas. He didn't fight, he just got quieter, and the quiet had weight. She didn't try to explain it to him. She had tried explaining things to people before. She knew how that went. "You mentioned that the frogs were gone and the deer had stopped coming down and the birds were moving wrong, and people looked at you the way they looked at a cracked window, registering the flaw, noting it wasn't their problem, moving on. So she worked alone. By the end of the first week of October, she had more dried food stored than she'd had in the previous 2 years combined. She had a working knowledge of 5 new plant varieties she'd been studying cautiously in her notebook for months. She had a plan for where she could forage in a pinch and where the land was most likely to stay productive even under stress. She had no idea what was coming exactly. She just knew something was. The afternoon Edith Crowley stopped her on the main road was not, by any measure, a remarkable day. The sky was the kind of pale October blue that made everything look sharper than it was. Maeve was walking back from a scouting trip, basket over her arm, mud on her boots, hair pinned back in a way she knew looked haphazard but couldn't bring herself to care about. Edith had 2 women with her, the Voss sisters, Hannah and Clara, which Maeve recognized immediately as a formation. Edith never confronted anyone alone if she could help it. She preferred an audience. She was a tall woman, handsome in an angular way, with a sharp forehead and sharper eyes, and the particular confidence of someone who had never had to question whether they belonged. "Maeve," she said it like a greeting that wasn't quite. "Edith, you've been down by the creek again." "I have." Hannah Voss pressed her lips together. Clara looked at Maeve's basket with an expression that wasn't curiosity. It was the look you gave something you'd already decided was less than you. "My Thomas says he saw you there practically every morning this week," Edith said, "collecting your things." A small pause around the word things that did a lot of work. "Your Thomas is welcome to join me if he'd like to learn something." Edith smiled. It was a particular kind of smile. "I suppose some of us have enough to do without wandering around in the mud." Maeve looked at her for a moment. There were about 12 things she could have said. She knew it, and so did Edith. I suppose so, Maeve said, and kept walking. She heard Clara Voss murmur something and Edith laugh, quick and bright, the kind of laugh specifically designed to reach the ears of the person walking away. Maeve didn't speed up. She didn't slow down. She went home and wrote 3 more pages in her notebook. The Beatles arrived on a Thursday. Nobody recognized what they were at first. Walt Ames noticed his corn leaves were looking ragged on Wednesday evening, but put it down to deer pressure. By Thursday morning, he was standing in his field looking at something that made no sense. The stalks stripped to bare veins, the damage spreading east in a visible line, like a stain moving through cloth. By Friday, it had reached 7 more farms. By Saturday, the valley knew it was serious. Maeve heard the news from Silas, who had heard it from the mill. She stood in her kitchen and felt the particular sensation of being right about something you desperately wished you'd been wrong about. She went to her shelf. She looked at her jars. She counted what she had, calculated what it meant. Then she walked to the window and looked out at Redbriar Crossing. The scattered houses, the smoke from the chimneys, the stripped and ruined fields beginning to spread like a bruise across the valley floor. Maeve! Silas was behind her. She could hear something different in his voice, something she hadn't heard in a long time, something close to worry. The Ames lost everything. Word is the Voss farm is half gone already. I know. What are we going to do? She turned around. We're going to eat, she said. I've been preparing for this. He stared at her. For this? For something. I didn't know what exactly. She pulled down a jar from the shelf. Silas, come sit down. I need to tell you what I've been doing and why, and I need you to actually listen. He sat down slowly, the way a man sits when the ground under him has just done something it wasn't supposed to do. And for the first time in probably 3 years, he listened. Outside, the wind moved through the valley. The ruined fields rustled with it, a sound like paper, dry and empty. Down by the creek, where the water ran cold and nobody had thought to look, the wild things grew on, uncollected, patient, waiting for whoever was ready to pay attention. The morning after Silas finally listened, he walked out to the ruined fields with his neighbor Walt Ames and didn't say a word about what his wife had told him the night before. Maeve understood that. She didn't hold it against him. A man needed time to rearrange his understanding of things, and Silas had spent 8 years quietly filing his wife under harmless but puzzling. One conversation wasn't going to undo that filing system overnight, so she didn't wait for him. She packed her second-best basket, the deep one with the reinforced handles, and walked down to the creek at first light before the settlement was properly awake. The air tasted like cold metal and dry leaves, the particular smell of October when it's turned serious. She worked fast, moving upstream to the densest stands of wild food she'd mapped the week before. Lamb's quarters, purslane, watercress along the shallower runs, the last of the late-season mushrooms clustered at the base of the old elm she'd been checking since August. Her hands moved without hesitation. She knew this ground. She was on her way back up the ridge path when she nearly walked into Ruth Heller. Ruth was 32, with 3 children under 8, and a husband, Caleb, whose farm had been among the first to go under. She was standing in the middle of the path with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and an expression on her face that Maeve recognized. Not embarrassment exactly, but the look of someone who had swallowed their pride so recently they could still taste it. I heard you were down here, Ruth said. Not quite an explanation, not quite an apology. Who told you? Clara Voss. She saw you heading down the hill. Ruth looked at the basket, then looked away. Caleb's trying to figure out what we do with the field, whether we can even... She stopped, started again. We don't have enough put by. I thought I'd come and see. Maeve looked at her for a moment. Ruth Heller had not been unkind to her over the years. She wasn't one of the ones who had said things to her face, but she had laughed once, 2 summers ago, when Edith had made a joke at Maeve's expense at the church social, and Maeve remembered it the way you remember a small, specific sting. She shifted the basket on her arm. Come on, then, she said. Ruth fell into step beside her, and Maeve started talking. Not in a lecture, not the way someone talks when they're proving a point, but the way her grandmother had talked to her, just explaining things as they walked. She pointed out the lamb's quarters and explained that it tasted somewhere between spinach and something wilder, that you could boil it or eat it raw, that the seeds were edible too if you needed to stretch things. She showed Ruth how to check watercress for freshness, how to tell the difference between plants that would feed you and ones that looked similar but wouldn't. Ruth didn't say much. She watched and listened in a focused, hungry way that had nothing to do with embarrassment anymore. By the time they got back up to level ground, Ruth had a small bundle under her arm and a different look on her face. "How long have you known about all this?" she asked. "A while." "And you never—" Ruth seemed to be choosing words carefully. "You never told anyone." "I told people." Maeve kept walking. They weren't interested. Ruth was quiet for a few steps. "No," she said finally. "I suppose we weren't." Within 3 days, the news of what Maeve knew had moved through the settlement the way news always moved through small places, sideways, without anyone being officially responsible for spreading it. She hadn't gone door to door. She hadn't put up a notice or called a meeting. She'd gone back to the creek, same as always, and found different people waiting for her at the base of the ridge path each morning. The first day it was Ruth again, with her eldest daughter Lucy, who was 9, and took in information with a startling, silent intensity. The second day it was Ruth plus Margaret Connolly, who had never said anything cruel about Maeve, but had also never said anything kind, and whose 4 children were now looking at a winter with badly depleted stores. The third day, 6 women came. Maeve taught all of them. She was patient, but not soft about it. She corrected mistakes directly. She made them touch and smell and taste things instead of just looking. She pushed back when someone said, "I don't think I can remember all this," by saying, "Then we'll do it again tomorrow until you do." She didn't perform warmth she wasn't feeling, but she taught everything she knew without holding anything back, without making anyone pay an apology for having dismissed her before. That part, she had decided, wasn't the point. The point was the children. That was the thing she kept coming back to. When she looked at Lucy Heller crouched beside the creek with her small hands carefully separating a stem to check its inner color, or at Margaret Connolly's twin boys tasting a piece of chickweed with their faces scrunched in evaluation, she felt something settle in her chest that was hard to name. These kids were going to remember this. Whatever happened with their parents, whatever embarrassment or pride got in the way. These children were going to carry this knowledge forward, and that mattered in a way that was longer than any single winter. She didn't say that out loud, she just kept teaching. Diamant. Silas noticed the change without commenting on it directly. He noticed it the way he noticed most things about his wife, peripherally, quietly, without fully committing to an opinion. But one evening he came in from checking the fences to find Maeve at the kitchen table with 3 women he vaguely recognized from the settlement. All of them bent over her notebook while she explained something in a low, focused voice, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with mud on his boots and an expression that was difficult to read. The women looked up. There was a beat of awkward silence. "Evening," Silas said, and hung up his hat, and went to wash his hands without saying anything else. Later, after the women had gone, he sat across from her while she wrote her notes for the day. "That was Margaret Connolly," he said. "Yes." "She told my brother last spring that she felt sorry for me." He said it without particular heat, just as information. Maeve looked up. "She's got 4 children who need to eat." Silas considered that. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. "You knew," he said. "Didn't you? Before the Beatles. You knew something was going to happen." "I thought something might." "Why didn't you—" He stopped himself. "Tell you?" She held his eyes. "I tried, Silas. About the frogs. About the birds. You were in the barn, and I came out, and I said something was off, and you said, 'I'm sure it's fine, Maeve,' and went back to what you were doing." He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped in the stove. "I'm sure it's fine, Maeve," he repeated slowly to himself, like he was checking whether he recognized the voice. "Yes," he exhaled, not the put-down exhalation from the doorway last week. This one was heavier and had more in it. "I'm sorry about that," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said, and meant it and went back to her notes. Not everyone came to the creek path. That was something Maeve had expected, and she'd been right. Redbriar Crossing had a particular kind of farmer. She'd grown up knowing them, had married one, for whom learning from the wrong person was not a thing they could bring themselves to do, regardless of consequences. Walt Ames was one of them. He stood in the ruins of his cornfield every morning like he was waiting for it to apologize and correct itself. He heard, through the settlement grapevine, that Maeve Callahan was teaching women how to forage along the creek, and his response to this information was to press his lips together and say nothing, which in Redbriar Crossing counted as a statement. His wife, Carol, came anyway. She came on a Wednesday morning without telling Walt first, and she stood slightly apart from the other women on the creek bank with the contained, careful posture of someone who had made a decision and didn't need to discuss it. Maeve showed her everything she showed the others. Carol Ames was a fast learner, methodical, precise, the kind of woman who only needed to see something once before it was filed away. She left with a full basket and a very small nod that Maeve understood as more than it looked. That evening, apparently, Walt Ames ate a meal of wilted lamb's quarters and wild garlic and flatbread made from dried amaranth seed, and he ate it without being told what was in it, and he cleaned his plate. Maeve heard this from Ruth, who heard it from Carol, who told it without commentary, which was the most expressive way Carol Ames communicated anything. It wasn't victory. Maeve didn't feel it as victory. It was just information, the kind that was useful to have. The problem with Edith Crowley wasn't that she was stupid. Maeve had known Edith for 11 years and had never once made the mistake of thinking she was stupid. What Edith had was a very particular intelligence, social, lateral, extremely sensitive to shifts in a community's attention. And right now that intelligence was telling her something she did not like. Maeve Callahan, who had spent the better part of a decade on the margins of Redbriar Crossing's social landscape, was now at its center. It had happened fast. That was what made it worse. 3 weeks ago, the Mercer woman was that odd, overweight wife who went collecting weeds by the creek and embarrassed her husband at community functions. Now she was the person with knowledge that fed children, and in a settlement facing a stripped harvest, there was no social currency more powerful than that. Edith watched it happening from her front porch, which had a good vantage point to the main road. She watched women walk down the ridge path in the early morning and come back with baskets. She watched children who had been pale and quiet starting to look steadier, with more color in their faces. She watched her neighbor Hannah Voss, who had laughed with her on the road when Maeve walked past, who had said some of us have real things to do, coming home from the creek with a sheaf of plants under her arm, and an expression that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. And she watched Thomas Riley, the most respected farmer in the valley, stop Maeve in the road one afternoon and speak to her for a full 5 minutes, hat actually in his hand while he listened to what she said, and that was the thing that settled it for Edith. She started, as she always started, with conversations. A word here, a question there. The thing about Edith Crowley was that she was rarely openly vicious. She was too intelligent for that, and too protective of her own reputation. What she did instead was plant seeds of uncertainty and let other people water them. Had anyone actually checked whether everything Maeve was teaching was safe? She didn't doubt the woman meant well, but meaning well wasn't the same as knowing what you were doing. And wasn't it strange, really, that none of this knowledge had surfaced before the crisis? Where had it come from? Who had taught her? She said these things to careful people who already had their own reasons to feel uneasy, people who'd been slow to accept Maeve's help and were now wondering if their hesitation might not have been, in retrospect, a form of good sense. Maeve felt the shift before she could point to evidence of it. It was a small thing first. A woman who had been coming to the creek 3 times a week skipped a morning, then 2, then stopped coming. A conversation that ended more quickly than it should have on the road to the mill. Silas mentioning carefully that someone had asked him whether he was confident in what his wife was doing. Confident how? Maeve had asked. That it's all safe. What she's feeding people. She had stood very still for a moment. Who asked you that? He looked uncomfortable. Reeves. Tom Reeves? Tom Reeves, who was Edith Crowley's cousin by marriage. There it was. I see, Maeve said. I told him yes, Silas said. He was looking at her directly now in a way that was, she noticed, something new. I told him of course it was safe. I've been eating it. She nodded once. Thank you, Silas. He nodded back. It wasn't a lot, in the large scheme of things, but it wasn't nothing. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they found traction in the settlement's existing anxiety. People who were frightened and hungry and uncertain about the winter ahead needed somewhere to put their fear, and Edith was offering them a container for it, a shape for the formless dread that was easier to hold than we don't know what's going to happen. And that's unbearable. The shape was, maybe it's her. Maeve kept teaching. She didn't defend herself in the road. She didn't go to anyone with explanations or evidence. She got up before sunrise and went to the creek and came back and taught whoever came. And she sent food home with families whether they'd asked for it or not, leaving bundles on porches when no one was watching. She was not, it must be said, serene about it. She was human about it, which was different. She went home some evenings and felt the burn of it in her chest, the specific, exhausting anger of someone who is being doubted about the thing they know better than anyone. She said things to Silas that were sharper than she intended. She burned dinner twice in 1 week because her mind was elsewhere. She lay awake Tuesday night running through arguments she'd never say out loud to anyone, cataloging her own rightness with the relentless energy of the wrongly accused. But she got up Wednesday morning and went to the creek. That was the whole of it, really. Not grace, not serenity, just getting up and going. The group that came on Wednesday was smaller than it had been the week before. She counted 4 women where there had been 8. She didn't remark on it. She looked at who was there and started teaching. Lucy Heller was there, the 9-year-old who'd come with her mother the very first morning. She had started coming alone. Ruth didn't always make it, but Lucy had not missed a single morning since the first day. She brought a small notebook now, her handwriting cramped and serious, noting down what Maeve showed her with a concentration that was almost uncomfortable to look at. There was something in it that made Maeve's chest ache in a complicated way. "What are you writing?" Maeve asked her once. Lucy looked up. "Everything," she said, like it was obvious. "Good," Maeve said. "Das sound nett." The resentment crested about 10 days into it, in a form that none of them had anticipated. It came through Margaret Connolly, who came to the creek path looking wrong. Too fast, something tight around her eyes. She pulled Maeve aside before the morning session started. "Someone left something on your porch," Margaret said. "Last night or early this morning, I walked past and saw it before I came down. I didn't want to. I thought you should know before Silas saw it." "What kind of something?" Margaret's mouth pressed together. "A dead crow, with something written on a piece of wood underneath it." Maeve stood very still. The creek ran behind them, indifferent as always. "What did it say?" "Take your poison plants and go back where you came from." The women who had overheard went quiet. Ruth Heller had her hand on Lucy's shoulder. The girl had heard it too, and was looking at Maeve with eyes that were trying to figure out the appropriate reaction. Maeve took a breath. Let it out slowly. The anger was there, solid and specific. A different anger than the nighttime rumination, this one colder and more useful. "All right," she said. "All right?" Margaret stared at her. "We've got wild garlic to harvest this morning. The stalks are getting past their best. Let's not waste the trip." She picked up her basket and headed toward the bank. After a moment, footsteps followed. She could feel Ruth Heller watching her back as she walked. She couldn't see Ruth's face, but she suspected the expression on it was something between stunned and something else. Something harder to name, the look of a person reconsidering what they thought toughness looked like. Maeve didn't look back. She crouched by the garlic and started harvesting, her hands steady, the cold water running a few feet from her knees, the morning light coming low and pale through the tree line. She had not come from anywhere else. She had been born 12 miles from this valley and had lived within its sight for 27 years. The crow on the porch was Edith's work, or someone she'd moved to it. Maeve didn't know which, and the distinction didn't change much. What it changed was the scale of what was coming. It had moved past whispers now. She filed that away and kept harvesting. By the time the settlement had its first hard frost of the season 2 days later, Maeve's stores were the fullest they'd ever been. Her notebooks were full, and 4 girls between the ages of 7 and 11 could identify 11 edible plants by sight and 2 more by smell alone. Whatever came next, that was already true, and nobody could take it back. The crow stayed on the porch for exactly as long as it took Silas to come home that evening and find it. Maeve heard the door open and close, heard his boots on the porch boards, then heard nothing for a moment. That particular quality of silence that means someone has stopped moving because something has stopped them. She set down her pen and waited. He came inside carrying the piece of wood with the writing on it. He'd already removed the crow, she supposed, or left it somewhere she wouldn't have to look at it first thing. He set the wood on the table between them and stood there with his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen in years, since a dispute over fence lines with a neighbor back in their first year of marriage, when Silas had gone very quiet and very still in a manner that meant he was working hard not to be loud about something. "Who did this?" he said. Not a question. "I don't know for certain." "Take a guess." She looked at the writing. The letters were uneven, pressed hard into the wood with something sharp. Someone had been angry when they wrote it, or had wanted it to look that way. "It doesn't matter who specifically," she said. "It's a symptom." "It's a threat, Maeve." "Yes, it's that too." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she associated with him being at the end of his ability to process something calmly. "I want to go talk to somebody," he said from behind his hands. "Silas? Not Edith. I'm not going to Edith." He dropped his hands. "But someone. Walt Ames or Thomas Riley or someone with standing in this settlement. Because this," he gestured at the wood, "this is not something we're going to just absorb and move on from." She watched him. In 8 years of marriage, she had fielded his quiet withdrawals, his uncomfortable silences, his careful avoidance of anything that might cause friction with the settlement's opinion of them. This was different. He was angry on her behalf, specifically and directly, and it was the kind of anger that had decided something. "Let me handle it my way first," she said. "Your way." "My way. Give me 2 weeks." He looked at her for a long moment. "And if it gets worse? Then you can go talk to Thomas Riley." He didn't like it. She could see that plainly, but he nodded, and that was the agreement. She picked up the piece of wood and put it on her shelf, not to look at, but so she wouldn't forget. 10 days after the crow, young Daniel Heller got sick. He was Ruth and Caleb's second child, 6 years old, with the kind of energy that made rooms feel smaller than they were. He came down with a fever on a Monday. First the heat, then the shivering, then the stillness that parents of young children recognize as the one that makes your stomach drop. Ruth sat with him through Monday night and sent Caleb for the doctor by Tuesday morning. Dr. Emmett Farrow rode in from the neighboring settlement of Porter's Gap, arriving Tuesday afternoon with his kit and his deliberate, unhurried manner. He examined Daniel thoroughly, asked careful questions, and came out of the bedroom to speak to Ruth in the kitchen. Maeve wasn't there. She didn't know any of this was happening until Ruth sent Lucy to her door Wednesday morning, the girl standing on the porch with her notebook under her arm and a look on her face that was trying very hard to be steady. "Mama says to tell you Danny's sick," Lucy said. "She says it's a fever. She says Dr. Farrow thinks it's seasonal. He's seen 4 cases in Porter's Gap this month already." She paused. "Mama wanted you to know that part, that Dr. Farrow said it himself, that it's seasonal." Maeve looked at her. "Why does your mother need me to know that specifically?" Lucy's jaw tightened slightly. 9 years old, with the composure of someone twice that. "Because people are saying things," she said. "People are saying Danny got sick from the plants." The silence between them had weight. "Which people?" Maeve said. "Mrs. Crowley told Mrs. Reeves, and Mrs. Reeves told Mrs. Voss. And now people are saying it around." Lucy's voice stayed controlled, but something was working underneath it. "Danny didn't eat anything wrong. He ate what we all ate. And Hannah and Clara aren't sick. Nobody who eats what you showed us is sick, but people are saying it anyway." Maeve stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this child who had come to her every single morning since October, rain or frost, notebook in hand, absorbing everything she could. She thought about what it cost Ruth Heller to send her daughter over here with this message, instead of coming herself. Ruth, who was sitting at her sick boy's bedside and still thinking clearly enough to send the one piece of information that mattered most. "Tell your mother thank you," Maeve said, "and tell her Danny's going to be all right. Seasonal fever in a healthy child his age with a good doctor, he'll be through it in a week." Lucy nodded once, sharp and certain, and left. Maeve went inside and stood at her shelf for a moment looking at her jars, her bundles, her cramped and careful notebooks. Then she went and sat at the table and stayed there for a while, not writing anything. By Thursday, it was no longer just whispers. Two families who had been taking food from Maeve, quietly, without fanfare, leaving baskets on the porch rather than collecting in person, sent those baskets back. Empty. No note. The emptiness was the note. A man named George Duff, who farmed the eastern edge of the valley and whose wife Agnes had been one of Maeve's most consistent students, stopped Silas on the road and said, with visible discomfort, that Agnes wouldn't be coming to the creek anymore. Silas asked why. George said he'd rather not say. Silas said he'd rather George did say, and there was a moment between the two men that Silas described to Maeve later as uncomfortable all around, at the end of which George said that Agnes was worried about the boy and wanted to be cautious until things were clearer. "Until things were clearer," Maeve repeated. "That's what he said. The doctor already said it was seasonal." "I know." "Pharaoh has been practicing medicine for 30 years. His word should be, I know, Maeve." Silas's voice was tired. "I'm not arguing the point with you. I'm telling you what George said." She stopped, took a breath. "Sorry." "Don't be. You're right. But being right isn't the same as being heard right now, and we both need to understand that clearly." That was, she thought, the most useful thing he had said in a long time. Dr. Pharaoh issued a written statement on Friday. He gave it to Thomas Riley, who had the most legible hand in the settlement, and Thomas read it aloud at the mill where men gathered in the morning. It stated plainly that Daniel Heller was suffering from a seasonal fever of the same type currently moving through 3 settlements in the region, that the illness predated any contact with foraged foods, that Pharaoh had examined the boy thoroughly and found no evidence whatsoever of plant-related illness, and that in his professional opinion, the rumors connecting Mrs. Mercer's foraging instruction to Daniel's condition were medically unfounded. It was a thorough and unambiguous statement. Maeve read her copy of it 3 times. It didn't stop anything. That was the part she hadn't fully prepared for. The way a story, once it has decided to be true in people's minds, doesn't unbind itself just because a document says it should. The fear had been looking for a container before Edith gave it one, and now that it had a shape, the shape persisted. People who'd been eating well because of Maeve's teaching suddenly became uncertain about whether they felt well. Agnes Duff told Ruth Heller she'd had a headache all week that she hadn't thought about until now. One of the Voss boys complained of a stomach ache, which could mean anything, but which Hannah Voss mentioned to 3 people before noon. Edith Crowley did not spread misinformation exactly. She was too precise for that. What she did was ask questions in public. Questions like, "Well, naturally, doctor. Pharaoh is a fine physician, but he's also only been here 2 days. Can he be expected to know everything about what people in this particular settlement have been eating? And I'm not saying anything against Maeve. I just think as mothers we have a responsibility to be cautious when our children are involved, don't we?" And the one that landed hardest, in a conversation at the Voss kitchen that 6 women overheard. "I just find it interesting that before all of this, we never had problems. And now we do." It was the logic of coincidence dressed up as cause. It was not sophisticated. But it didn't need to be. It just needed to land in the gap between what people knew and what they feared, and in the second week of November in a settlement staring down a stripped harvest and a hard winter, that gap was wide enough to drive a wagon through. The note appeared on a Saturday morning tucked under a stone on Maeve's front step, not carved wood this time. Paper, folded twice. The writing was different from the Crow message. Different hand, more careful letters, which meant a different person or someone who'd had time to disguise their usual writing. It said, "Leave this settlement before something worse happens. We know what you've done." She read it twice, then folded it again and put it in her apron pocket and went about her morning. The morning included grinding dried amaranth, checking the root cellar inventory against her estimates for the winter, and bringing a bundle of dried lamb's quarters to old Francis Morrow, who was 73 and lived alone on the western edge of the settlement and had nobody to send to the creek on her behalf. Francis was, as far as Maeve could tell, the only person in Redbriar Crossing who had never said anything negative about her, primarily because Francis was largely indifferent to what anyone did with their time as long as they didn't bother her with it. Francis opened the door before Maeve knocked, the way she always did. The woman had the hearing of a barn cat. "You look like something's eating at you," Francis said, stepping aside to let her in. "I got another note this morning." "Threatening?" "Suggesting I leave." Francis made a sound in her throat that was not sympathetic in any soft sense, but was something. She took the bundle of lamb's quarters and set it on her table. "You going to?" "No." "Didn't think so." She moved to put the kettle on slowly, with the economy of motion that came from 73 years of not wasting effort. "You know what the interesting part is?" "Tell me." "The interesting part is that they're scared." She said it flatly, without drama. "Not of you poisoning their children. That's not the real fear. They're scared because the thing they thought kept them safe, the farming, the crops, the way they've always done it, failed. And you didn't fail. And that's harder to sit with than they've got words for." Maeve sat down at Francis's kitchen table, which she had sat at maybe twice in 11 years. The kettle began to tick on the stove. "I know that," Maeve said, "knowing it doesn't make it easier." "No," Maeve agreed, "it doesn't." Francis sat down across from her with the unhurried manner of someone who had watched enough trouble pass through enough years to know you mostly just had to wait for it to finish. "What are you going to do?" Maeve was quiet for a moment. The right thing to say was something resolute, something about continuing regardless, something that sounded like a decision made from clarity. But Francis was 73 and alone, and had no patience for performance. "I don't entirely know yet," Maeve said. Francis nodded like that was the most honest answer she'd heard in a while. "Tea?" "Yes, thank you." The thing Maeve decided on was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no public speech, no moment where she stood in the center of town and declared herself. She had seen enough of Redbriar Crossing's social mechanics to know that anything that looked like a bid for attention would be turned against her. What she decided on was simpler and, in its own way, harder. She would keep delivering. She would bring food to every family that would take it, and to some that wouldn't, leaving things on porches before dawn when no one was watching. She would continue teaching anyone who came to the creek. She would not defend herself in conversation, would not counter Edith's questions with arguments, would not ask Dr. Farrow to speak again on her behalf. She would just keep doing the things she had always been doing, with or without an audience, with or without approval. It was not a strategy born from nobility. She was too tired and too angry for nobility. It was born from the simpler recognition that stopping was the only thing that would actually prove them right. The hardest delivery was the Crowley house. She stood on Edith's front porch on a Tuesday evening at dusk with a bundle of dried greens and a small clay jar of preserved wild garlic, and knocked before she could think about it further. There was a long pause. Then the door opened, and Edith stood there in the lamplight with her hand on the doorframe and an expression that moved through several things in quick succession before settling on something guarded. Maeve held out the bundle. "For your household," she said. Edith looked at the bundle. She looked at Maeve. A long, specific silence opened up between them, the kind that contains a whole argument that neither person is going to say out loud. "I don't think that's necessary," Edith said finally. "Probably not," Maeve said, "but here it is anyway." She set the bundle on the porch railing. Edith didn't pick it up, but she didn't step forward and knock it off either. Maeve turned and walked back down the path to the road. She didn't look back. She didn't know whether Edith took it inside or left it to freeze on the railing. It didn't change what she'd done. Daniel Heller broke his fever on a Wednesday, 8 days after it started. Ruth sent Lucy with the news, the same way she'd sent her before. The girl arrived at the creek bank where Maeve was running the morning session. 4 women and 3 children, smaller than the group had been at its peak, but still present, still learning, and told her quietly that Danny was sitting up and eating and that the fever was gone. The women on the bank heard it. There was a collective exhale that nobody quite gave voice to. That afternoon, Ruth came herself for the first time in 2 weeks. She came without the basket she usually brought, without her notebook, without the purposeful morning lesson energy she typically carried. She just came and stood at the edge of the bank while Maeve finished explaining something to Margaret Connolly's oldest boy about the difference between two similar-looking plants. When the boy had moved off with the others, Ruth said, "I should have come sooner." Maeve looked at her. Ruth's face had the worn, scraped look of someone coming out the other side of a terrible week. There were shadows under her eyes, and her mouth was set in a way that had something apologetic in it that she was clearly finding difficult to voice directly. "You were with your son," Maeve said. "That's where you should have been." "I heard what they were saying. I knew it wasn't from you, but I didn't say anything to anybody. I just stayed inside with Danny and didn't say anything, and that wasn't—" She stopped. "That wasn't right." Maeve was quiet for a moment. The creek ran on behind them. "He's going to be fine," she said. "That's the part that matters." "Maeve," Ruth's voice cracked slightly at the edge. "They put a dead bird on your porch. Someone threatened you in writing. I heard about both of those things, and I said nothing, and I need you to know that I know that was wrong." This was the kind of moment that in a different kind of story would have a clean resolution, an embrace, a declaration of restored trust, tears and forgiveness flowing. What actually happened was that Maeve stood there with mud on her boots and the cold coming off the water and felt the truth of what Ruth was saying and also felt the complicated weight of it, the way you can accept an acknowledgement and still carry the thing it's acknowledging at the same time. "I know," Maeve said, "and I accept it." It wasn't everything, but it was honest. Ruth seemed to understand that because she nodded once and didn't push for more. "Lucy's been teaching me," Ruth said after a moment with a small, strange smile. "My 9-year-old has been teaching me what she learned here, which is, I don't know what that is." "That's what's supposed to happen," Maeve said. "That's the whole point." Ruth looked at her for a moment with an expression that was impossible to entirely decode. Something about recognition, maybe, or about seeing something clearly that you'd been looking at sideways for a long time. "I'll come tomorrow morning," Ruth said. "Good," Maeve said. "Bring your notebook. We're covering mushroom varieties this week, and it takes more than one session to get right." The Sunday that Dr. Farrow stopped by before heading back to Porter's Gap, he didn't come to the Mercer house on any official business. He came because, he said, he preferred to say things to people's faces rather than through intermediaries. He was a compact man in his late 50s, with gray at his temples, and the kind of directness that came from decades of telling people things they didn't want to hear. Silas let him in and stood in the kitchen while he and Maeve talked, which was its own kind of statement. "I want you to know," Farrow said, setting his hat on his knee, "that what I wrote in that statement is what I stand by. The boy's illness was seasonal and pre-existing. There is nothing in what you've been teaching these families that would cause harm. I examined the plants you use. I'm familiar with most of them. What you're doing here it's sound. It's more than sound." "Thank you," Maeve said. "I also want you to know that my statement didn't settle things the way I hoped." "No," she said. "It didn't." He nodded. He looked like a man who had come partly to apologize for something that wasn't his fault. "Fear is a difficult thing to treat," he said. "More difficult than fever in my experience. It doesn't respond to evidence the way it should. I've noticed that. What you're doing, continuing regardless." He seemed to be looking for the right word. "It's the correct approach, medically speaking. And in every other sense I can think of." He stood up, put his hat back on. "If there's anything I can do formally, that would be of use." "There might be," Maeve said. "When spring comes and things are calmer, I'd like to put together something more formal, a written guide to the edible plants in this region. If you would be willing to review it for medical accuracy, that would mean something to people here." He looked at her steadily. "I would be glad to," he said. After he'd gone, Silas stood in the kitchen for a moment. "A written guide," he said. "A proper one, with illustrations if I can manage it." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully classify, something between bewildered and proud, with a layer under it that might have been something like awe, if Silas were the kind of man who used that word, which he wasn't. "All right," he said. Outside the window, the first snow of the season had begun to fall on Redbriar Crossing. It came down fine and steady, covering the stripped fields and the frostbitten road, and the porch where the crow had been left, and the railing where Maeve had set a bundle of greens for a woman who might or might not have taken them inside. It covered everything equally, the way weather does, without opinion. Maeve watched it for a moment, then turned back to her shelf and her notebooks, and the work that was still in front of her. The snow that had begun falling on Sunday did not stop until Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Redbriar Crossing was buried under 14 inches, which was not remarkable for the region in December, except that it was the first week of November. Nobody had been ready for it, not psychologically, not practically. The storm arrived 3 weeks ahead of any reasonable expectation, which meant firewood stacked for a normal season was suddenly short, which meant the stripped harvest looked even more catastrophic against the white, which meant every family in the valley woke up Wednesday morning doing the same calculation and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Maeve had been doing that calculation since October. She was in the root cellar before sunrise Wednesday, moving through her inventory with a lantern, counting and recounting. She had more than she'd thought, which was the result of the past 6 weeks of aggressive preparation, and the math was survivable. Not comfortable, but survivable. She climbed back up into the kitchen and wrote the numbers in her notebook and sat with them for a while. Silas came down at first light, took one look at her face, and poured himself coffee without asking how the numbers looked. He had learned in the past few weeks to read her silences with a precision he hadn't bothered to develop in the previous 8 years. She appreciated it without saying so directly. "How are we?" he said. "We're all right. We'll need to be careful about the dried stores through February, but we have enough if we're not wasteful. And the creek bank, with this snow, the watercress will keep under the ice if the current stays strong enough. Some of the root systems are still viable under the frost line. It's harder work in winter, but it's not nothing." She looked up from her notebook. "The Hellers are my concern. Ruth didn't come yesterday, and they were already running lean before this." Silas nodded slowly. He set his coffee down. "I'll take something over this morning." She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the snow with his jaw set and his hands wrapped around the cup, and she understood that this was not a casual offer. It was a decision he'd been sitting with, the kind that a man makes when he has spent enough time on the wrong side of something and is trying to come back across without making a production of it. "Take the lamb's quarters from the third shelf," she said, "and the jar of preserved garlic, and there's a bundle of dried mushrooms on the left side tied with red thread. Those too." He nodded, got up, started moving things into a carry sack without ceremony. That was the version of Silas Mercer that she had married, she thought, the one that was there underneath the years of quiet embarrassment. She didn't say that out loud, but she thought it. That the storm changed things in a way that Edith's campaign had not been able to, because the storm made the calculation concrete and personal in a way that rumor couldn't compete with. When the snow came down and the temperatures dropped and families opened their cellar doors and looked at what they had to last through winter, the question stopped being abstract. It stopped being about who you were willing to learn from or what that said about you. It became a simpler and more urgent question. Are my children going to eat? The women came back to the creek. Not all at once. Not with any announcement. Agnes Duff appeared on Thursday morning at the base of the ridge path with her basket and her eyes directed slightly to the left of Maeve's face, the posture of someone who is choosing not to acknowledge a period of absence because acknowledging it would require explaining it. Maeve registered this and said nothing about it, and showed Agnes where the best winter watercress was running under the near-frozen shallows. The Voss sisters came Friday, both of them, walking together in a way that suggested mutual moral support. Clara still had that evaluative look she'd worn on the road the day Edith made the joke about weeds, but it had changed character. It was no longer the look of someone deciding something is beneath them. It was more the look of someone who has already decided they were wrong about something and is now deciding how to live with that. Hannah was more direct. She came to stand beside Maeve on the bank while the others were working and said without any preamble, "I want you to know I never believed Danny's fever had anything to do with you." Maeve kept her eyes on what she was doing. "But you stopped coming." A pause. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause, longer. "Because it was easier," Hannah said, quietly, without dressing it up. "Because Edith was very certain, and you seemed like you'd be fine either way, and I have my mother and 3 children to think about, and it was easier to step back than to say something." Maeve turned and looked at her. Hannah Voss met her eyes, which took visible effort. "I appreciate you telling me that directly," Maeve said. "I didn't expect you to accept us back without saying something about it. I'm not accepting you back. You can come, or you cannot come. What you learn here is for your children, not for my satisfaction." She turned back to the bank. "Now, come down here and let me show you how to find the root systems under the frost line, because that's what we're covering this morning." Hannah came down the bank. She didn't say anything else, but she paid attention with the focused, grateful intensity of someone given a second chance they weren't sure they deserved. Thomas Riley came to see Maeve the following week. He came to the house this time, formally, in the middle of the afternoon, which meant he had thought about it rather than catching her on the road. Thomas was 54, with a broad, deliberate face and the unhurried manner of a man who had been the most respected farmer in the valley long enough that he no longer needed to prove it. He removed his hat at the door. Silas let him in and left them in the kitchen, which was also a deliberate choice, giving Maeve the space to have the conversation without a witness she hadn't asked for. Thomas sat down at the table and turned his hat in his hands twice before speaking. "I want to talk to you about the winter," he said. "All right." "I've been going around the settlement, talking to families about their stores, their situations. Getting a picture." He set the hat on the table. "The picture is not good. We've got 4 families who are in serious trouble. The Duffs are worse than George let on. The Connollys are short. The Reeves family lost more than they admitted. And there's an older woman on the north edge, Willa Peters, who's been alone all season and may not—" He stopped. "May not have enough." Maeve knew Willa Peters. Not well. The woman was private and had never been part of the settlement's social networks. But she knew where she lived, and she knew she'd been sending Ruth by with bundles every week, though she hadn't been sure they were being taken in. "What do you need from me?" Maeve said. Thomas looked at her. There was something in his expression that took her a moment to identify, partly because she hadn't seen it directed at her before. It was respect. Specific, unperformed respect. The kind that comes from a person who takes such things seriously and doesn't dispense them carelessly. "I need you to teach me," he said. "I need to understand what you know well enough to help coordinate it across the settlement. I should have come to you weeks ago. I didn't, and I'm not going to stand here and give you a long explanation of why, because I think you already know why, and I think we're both past the point where that's useful." Maeve considered him for a moment. "The women have been building something at the creek for 6 weeks," she said. "They know things now. The coordination should go through them. They're the ones who've been doing the work. If you come to me to learn and then take it to the settlement as something you discovered, that'll matter to them. And they'll know." He absorbed that. "You're right," he said. "That's not what I meant, but I understand why you'd think it might be. Then come to the creek, same as everyone else, and bring Walt Ames." He looked at her steadily. "Walt's not going to—" "Walt Ames's wife has been one of my best students all season," Maeve said. "She knows more about winter foraging than he does. If he comes to the creek with Thomas Riley, that's one thing. If he comes to the creek because Carol asks him to and because his children need to eat, that's the thing that might actually stick." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then something changed in his face, a small shift, the adjustment of a man updating his estimate of someone. "I'll talk to Carol," he said. "Good." She stood up. Tuesday morning, 6 o'clock, dress warm. He stood, picked up his hat. At the door he turned back. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "for what it's worth, I heard what was being said about you, about the boy, about the plants. I should have spoken up against it more forcefully than I did. You read the doctor's statement publicly. That's not the same as speaking up." She held his eyes. "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's something. He nodded and left. She heard his horse moving away down the road. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she added Tuesday. Bring extra on mushroom identification to the day's notes, and moved on. Walt Ames came on Tuesday. He came with Thomas Riley, as Maeve had expected, but he also came with Carol, which she hadn't fully expected, and with his two eldest sons, 14 and 16, which she hadn't expected at all. He was a tall man with a farmer's build and a face that had difficulty with subtlety. Standing at the creek bank at 6 in the morning with his hat in his hands, he looked exactly like what he was. A proud man doing something that was costing him something, and not entirely sure what expression to wear about it. Maeve let him stand there for a moment, not to punish him, just because the moment was real and there was no point papering over it. "Mr. Ames," she said. "Mrs. Mercer." He cleared his throat. Carol said, "She's been telling me." He stopped. His jaw moved. "I should have come sooner." It was not an eloquent apology. It was not even entirely an apology, more a statement of fact offered in an apologetic direction. But it was Walt Ames standing at a creek bank he'd have crossed to the other side of 6 weeks ago, and it was real, and Maeve took it as what it was. "Your boys are going to be my best students this morning," she said. 14 and 16, they'll carry this the rest of their lives. Let's not waste the morning. Something in Walt's face shifted. Something loosened quietly. He nodded once and stepped forward, and Carol Ames glanced at Maeve with an expression that was brief and contained and said more than a sentence could have. The sons were, as it turned out, exactly as fast as she'd predicted. The 16-year-old had a natural eye for plant identification that reminded her of Lucy Heller, the ability to see pattern and distinction where other people saw only similarity. By the end of the morning, he had correctly identified 8 species without prompting, and Maeve told him so plainly, and he looked briefly, fiercely pleased in the way of teenage boys who aren't expecting to be noticed for something. Walt Ames watched all of it. He didn't say much, but he stayed the full session, and when Maeve demonstrated how to check a root system under frozen ground, crouching in the frost and using her hands without hesitation, her breath coming out in clouds, she noticed him watching with a careful attention that was different from skepticism. It was the attention of a man actively revising something. Willa Peters was the hardest. Maeve went to her on Thursday, alone, with a full pack on her back and her best lantern because Willa's cabin sat far enough north that the afternoon light didn't reach it well in December. The path was heavy with snow, barely walkable in places. She was out of breath twice on the climb, which she minded less than she used to. Willa opened the door before she knocked. Apparently that was a trait among the older women of the settlement, this uncanny door sense, and looked at Maeve and the pack with an expression that was difficult to characterize. Willa Peters was 70 or thereabouts. She'd lived in the settlement longer than almost anyone and had been largely self-sufficient in a way that had curdled over the years into something closer to isolation. "I don't need charity," Willa said. "I know," Maeve said. "I brought food, and I'd like you to teach me how you've been managing out here this long, if you're willing. I'll leave the food either way." Willa looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were sharp and dark and missed nothing. "You want to learn something from me," she said flatly. "You've been living at the north end of this valley for 40 years. You must know things about the land up here that I haven't mapped yet." Maeve kept her voice level. "I'm not being polite. I mean it." Another long look. Then Willa stepped back from the door. It was the beginning of something that Maeve hadn't anticipated, but probably should have. Because Willa Peters, it turned out, knew about the North Slope in winter, in a way that was specific and deep and different from anything in Maeve's notebooks. She knew where certain mosses stayed viable under ice, which bark was safe to prepare in desperate conditions, where the ground stayed soft enough near a thermal seam to harvest roots even in deep freeze. She'd learned it over 40 years of quiet observation, alone, with no one to tell. Maeve filled 6 pages that afternoon. Willa talked in the direct, unsentimental way of someone who had long since given up on being interesting and just wanted to be accurate. "Why haven't you shared any of this?" Maeve asked at one point. Willa looked at her. Who was going to listen? Maeve had no answer to that. because it was the same question that could have been asked of her for 11 years, and the answer was the same answer. "Well," Maeve said, "I'm listening now." Willa refilled both their cups with something dark and bitter that wasn't quite tea and wasn't quite anything Maeve recognized. "Drink that," she said. "It's good for your knees. The cold's been hard on them. I can see it in how you moved coming up the path." Maeve drank it without argument. The first real crack in Edith Crowley's certainty came from an unexpected direction. It came from her own kitchen. Her youngest, a boy of 10 named Frederick, had been with Thomas Riley's children at a gathering the week before, where Lucy Heller had informally demonstrated some of what she'd learned at the creek. Lucy had a gift for teaching that was, if anything, more natural than Maeve's. She was 9 and had the ability to explain things in the exact language another child would understand, without simplifying them into uselessness. Frederick had come home knowing 3 edible plants and had pointed them out through the kitchen window with the specific excited pride of a child who has just discovered they know something. Edith had been short with him about it, more short than she meant to be, and she knew it even as it was happening, the way you sometimes say a thing and feel the wrongness of it in the same moment you say it. Frederick had gone quiet in the way children go quiet when they understand, without quite being able to articulate it, that the adult in the room is upset about something that has nothing to do with them. She thought about that afterward. Not immediately. She had too much invested in her position to walk it back quickly, and she was not the kind of person who revised easily. But the image of Frederick's face came back to her at inconvenient moments. In the morning when she looked at their thinning store of preserves. In the evening when she tried to calculate how deep into winter they were and how far they still had to go. She had not taken the bundle Maeve left on her porch railing. She'd left it there for a day and a half, in the cold, telling herself she'd get to it, telling herself she hadn't decided yet. Then a wind had come up and knocked it into the snow in the yard, and she'd watched it from the window and done nothing, and in the morning it was buried, and she'd thought about it longer than she had thought about almost anything that week. The thing about Edith was not that she was heartless. She had convinced herself that wasn't true. And in this she was largely right. What she was instead was a person who had built her identity so thoroughly around being the person who set the social standards of Red Briar Crossing that any challenge to those standards felt like a challenge to her survival. And what Maeve represented, a woman outside all the recognized categories of value, offering something the recognized categories had failed to provide, was not just a challenge. It was a refutation. She couldn't admit the refutation, not yet. But she was sitting with it, which was its own kind of progress. The conversation that broke it open happened on a Sunday afternoon in December in the Crowley kitchen between Edith and her husband Frank. Frank Crowley was not a remarkable man in most ways. He was quiet where Edith was sharp, slow to form opinions where she was quick, content where she was driven. He had always let Edith navigate their social world because she was better at it, and because, in truth, it mattered more to her. And a man who cares less about a thing is generally wise to let the person who cares more make the decisions. But Frank had been thinking for several weeks about the winter and their situation, with the steady, private calculation of a man who doesn't speak often, but does not stop thinking. "We should go to the creek," he said, at the table. Specifically, Sunday afternoon. Edith looked up from her mending. "What?" "Tuesday morning. I heard that's when the sessions are. We should go." She set down the mending. "Frank!" "The stores are going to be short by February," he said, in his flat, even way. Not an accusation, just mathematics. "I don't want to have a conversation in February about how we ended up short when we had the option to do something about it in December. It's not that simple." "It seems like it is." "What I've said about that woman, Edith." He said her name in the particular way he had, not cutting, just placing. "What you've said is your concern. What happens to our children in February is mine." He picked up his coffee. "We'll go Tuesday." She sat across from him in a silence that was nothing like the easy, comfortable silence of their normal evenings. This was a loaded silence, the kind where a person is confronting something about themselves in real time and doesn't have anywhere comfortable to look while they do it. "I don't know what to say to her," Edith said, finally. Frank considered that. Maybe nothing, he said. Maybe you just show up and learn something. Maybe that's enough to start. They came on Tuesday, both of them. The group that morning was the largest it had been. 15 people, the core women plus the new men, Thomas Riley's two eldest boys, Walt's sons, Carol Ames, and others who had heard through the settlement's relentless word of mouth that something was happening at the creek that was worth knowing about. Edith stood at the edge of the bank in a good coat that was impractical for creek bank conditions, which told Maeve that she had not quite been able to dress as though this was something she'd planned to do. Frank stood beside her, in the right boots, which told Maeve something about the respective conditions of their acceptance. Maeve looked at Edith. Edith looked at Maeve. A year's worth of something passed between them in that look. Not resolved, not dissolved, but acknowledged. The way you acknowledge a thing that exists before you decide what to do with it. Maeve turned to the group. We're going to cover route identification under frozen conditions this morning, she said, which means we're getting our hands cold and our knees dirty, so if anyone's wearing their good coat, a single beat of pause. You might want to push up the sleeves. A few people laughed. Frank Crowley laughed. Even Edith, after a moment, made a sound that was in the vicinity of a laugh, surprised out of her. Maeve crouched at the bank and started the session. She didn't look back to see if Edith was following, but she heard, behind her, the sound of boots coming carefully down toward the frozen mud. And then the sound of someone crouching. And then a question, quiet, specific, real, in a voice she recognized. She answered it the same way she answered every question, directly, without performance, without point scoring, because the point was never the point. The point was the knowledge, and what it could do in the hands of people who finally understood they needed it. The creek ran on under its skin of ice, patient as it had always been, carrying everything downstream the way it always had. The settlement's stripped fields lay white and buried beyond the tree line. But along the bank, in the cold and the mud and the pale winter light, something that had started as one woman crouching alone was now 15 people crouching together. And the knowledge that had lived only in Maeve Callahan's notebooks was alive now in other hands. That wouldn't fix everything. The winter was still long. The stores were still lean. The pride of Red Briar Crossing was still a complicated, difficult thing that would take more than one Tuesday morning to fully undo. But 15 people knew how to feed their families from the land under the snow, and tomorrow there would be 16, and the day after that more. And that was the kind of arithmetic that didn't go backward. The winter of 1887 in Red Briar Crossing was, by any objective measure, the hardest the valley had seen in 20 years. January came in with temperatures that cracked wood and froze the creek solid from bank to bank for the first time anyone under 50 could remember. The snow that had started in early November kept coming, not in dramatic storms, but in the steady, accumulating way that is somehow worse, the kind of winter that doesn't announce itself with spectacle, but simply presses down, week after week, until people start calculating in ways they don't say out loud. February brought a wind that came off the northern hills and found every gap and every wall, and 3 families in the settlement burned through their firewood reserves 2 months ahead of schedule and had to make decisions that no family wanted to make. But nobody starved. That was the fact that sat at the center of everything, quiet and undramatic and enormous. In a winter that should have broken the settlement, that would have broken it if the harvest failure had been met only with the resources the valley had on hand in October. Nobody starved. Children who should have been gaunt by February were thin but steady. Families who had entered winter with dangerously short stores made it through on a combination of what they'd preserved and what they'd learned to find, and the two things together were just enough. Just enough is not a comfortable place to live. Maeve knew that better than most. Just enough means you're aware of the margin at all times, means you ration and calculate and lie awake doing arithmetic. Just enough is not the same as fine, but it is the difference between a community that comes out the other side and one that doesn't. And in the valley of Red Briar Crossing in the winter of 1887, that difference had a name. Most people were starting to use it. Edith Crowley came to the creek for 6 consecutive Tuesdays before she said anything to Maeve directly. In those 6 weeks she learned. She was not, it turned out, a natural. She was too impatient, too accustomed to being competent at things to tolerate the learning curve with grace, and Maeve watched her frustration flare and get controlled more than once during demonstrations. But she was intelligent, and she was disciplined, and what she lacked in instinct she compensated for with sheer methodical effort. By the 5th Tuesday, she could correctly identify 9 plants without prompting. By the 6th, she was helping Margaret Connolly's youngest boy understand why you checked the underside of leaves, explaining it with a clarity that was, Maeve had to admit, better than her own explanation of the same thing. Watching Edith Crowley teach a 6-year-old something she had learned from Maeve was one of the stranger experiences of that winter. The conversation came on a Thursday, not a Tuesday. Not at the creek, but in the road, which felt accidental even if it probably wasn't. Edith was carrying a basket. Maeve was coming back from Willa Peters' cabin, her pack lighter than when she'd gone, her notebook fuller. They stopped. The road was empty in both directions. The light was the low, thin light of February in the late afternoon, everything pale and shadowless. "I need to say something to you," Edith said. Her voice had none of its usual social management. It was just her voice, which was a different thing. "All right," Maeve said. What I said about you, about the plants and Danny Heller." She stopped, started again with visible effort. "I knew it wasn't true. I don't mean I suspected. I mean I knew, and I said it anyway, or I let people say it, and I didn't stop them, which is the same thing." Maeve waited. Edith seemed to be looking for the honest word, not the palatable one. "I was frightened. Not of you. Of what you represented. Of the fact that everything we'd built here, everything I thought I understood about what mattered and what didn't, what was useful and what wasn't, you were walking around being evidence that I'd been wrong about it." She pressed her lips together. "That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. I'm trying to explain what was true, not justify it." Maeve looked at her for a long moment. The cold sat between them, neutral and patient. "I know what it is to have people decide you don't matter," Maeve said. "I know what it does to a person over time. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing. The crow on the porch, the note. Danny Heller's family going through what they went through while people used his sick child to—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "It was a lot, Edith." "Yes," Edith said, "it was. But I also know that the things people do out of fear are different from the things they do out of cruelty, even when they look the same from the outside. And I know you have children. And I know this winter has been its own kind of education for everyone in this valley, including you." Edith's jaw was tight. She was holding herself very still, in the way of a person who is not going to cry in a road, but is having to work at it. "I don't know what to do with what I've done," Edith said. "I don't know how that gets fixed." "It probably doesn't get fixed," Maeve said. "It gets carried. You know what you did, and I know what you did, and we both keep going. That's the realistic version." She shifted her pack on her shoulder. "The other version is you keep coming on Tuesdays and you teach your children what you're learning and you don't do it again. That's what matters to me more than an apology." Edith looked at her with an expression that was raw and complicated and not particularly comfortable. "That's it?" "That's not a small thing, Edith." A beat of silence. Then Edith exhaled. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." They parted in the road without ceremony. No embrace, no declaration. Maeve walked the rest of the way home with the cold at her back and the particular feeling of a thing that has been sitting unfinished for months finally arriving at something like an ending. Not a clean ending, just a real one. February turned into March in the way that late winter always does. Reluctantly, in increments, with frequent reversals. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. A stretch of melting that refroze overnight and made the paths treacherous. The creek began making sounds under its ice, the deep liquid movement audible before the surface broke, a kind of subterranean reckoning. Maeve heard it on a morning in early March when she came down to the bank and stood on the ice-crusted mud listening. The sound the water made under the ice was different from summer, more pressured, more intentional. Something working to get through. She knew that feeling. Daniel Heller was fully recovered and had been for months. He'd grown, visibly, through the winter, shot up 2 inches the way young boys do in hard seasons, as if the body has been saving something for when the conditions are difficult enough to demand it. He came to the creek with Lucy sometimes now, the two of them arriving in the early morning with their notebooks. Lucy still the more focused of the two, but Daniel coming along, developing that careful eye that Maeve had started to recognize as the particular intelligence of people who paid attention to living things. Lucy Heller at 9 was already something that was difficult to categorize. She had filled her original notebook and was halfway through a second one. She had started making small drawings alongside her notes. Not decorative, functional, the kind of precise botanical sketches that served as identification guides. She had, in the latter weeks of winter, begun adding her own observations rather than just transcribing Maeve's. Things she'd noticed on her own, conditions she'd checked independently, questions she'd formed without being asked to form them. One morning in late February, she had pulled Maeve aside before the session started to show her a page of notes from the previous week. "I went up to the North Slope on Saturday," she said. "The one past Willa Peters' cabin, where you said the thermal seam runs." Maeve looked at her. "I said that was for adults. I was careful. I didn't go alone." She didn't say who she'd gone with, which meant she'd probably taken her brother, and Maeve filed that away and let it pass. "But I found something." She turned the notebook to a sketch. Rough but accurate, the identifying marks noted alongside. "This was under the moss on the sheltered side. I don't have this one. What is it?" Maeve looked at the sketch, looked at Lucy, felt something that was not quite pride but was in that neighborhood. The particular satisfaction of watching a thing you've started take on a life that doesn't need you to sustain it anymore. "Where's your pencil?" Maeve said. Lucy produced it. "Write this down," Maeve said, and began to tell her. The written guide came together through March. It had been in Maeve's head since the conversation with Dr. Farrow in November, and the winter had given her the material to make it comprehensive in ways she hadn't initially planned. Willa Peters contributed 2 sessions that Maeve transcribed in full. Ruth Heller helped organize the sections after Maeve complained one evening that she couldn't see the structure from inside the thing. Silas, unexpectedly, turned out to have a steady and legible hand, and when Maeve mentioned one night that the fair copies were taking twice as long as the drafts, he sat down without comment and started copying. She watched him work at the kitchen table, head down, hand moving careful and slow, and thought about the man she'd married and the man he'd been for the middle 8 years and the man he'd become, tentatively and with some stumbling, in the last 4 months. He was not a changed man in any dramatic sense. He was the same Silas, patient, practical, uncomfortable with anything that felt like performance. But he had moved, and moving was the thing. "Your handwriting is better than mine," she told him one evening. "It always was," he said, without looking up. She laughed. Actually laughed, the way she hadn't in a while. He looked up at the sound of it, a little surprised, and then something in his face relaxed. They worked late that night. The fire burned down, and they didn't notice. Dr. Farrow returned in April, as he'd said he would. He spent 2 full days reviewing the guide, sitting at Maeve's kitchen table with the pages spread before him, making notations in the margins with a small, precise hand. He corrected 2 things, a preparation note on one plant species and a seasonal timing on another, and left everything else as it was. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her. "How many plants?" he said. 43 primary species, 11 secondary with seasonal caveats." He shook his head slowly. Not negatively, the slow head shake of someone recalibrating a number they'd had in mind. "This needs to be copied," he said. "Multiple copies. I want to take one to Porter's Gap. I know settlements further east that—" He stopped. "Mrs. Mercer, this is not a local document. This is something that could move through the whole frontier region. There are families 40 miles from here who need to know what's in these pages." Maeve looked at the pages on the table. 43 primary species, 11 secondary. Willa Peters' notes on the North Slope. The mushroom section with Lucy's sketches. Because she'd asked Lucy, and Lucy had produced 8 clean, accurate illustrations in a week, with a focus that had impressed Farrow visibly when he saw them. "Then we'll make copies," Maeve said. "Do you want to travel? To take it yourself? To other settlements?" He asked it carefully, like he wasn't sure what her answer would be. She considered it, honestly and not briefly, The woman who had walked this creek for years with a basket and a notebook, and the particular endurance of someone who does necessary work without expectation of recognition, that woman had not done what she'd done in order to become something. She hadn't been building toward a destination. She'd been paying attention because the world required someone to pay attention, and she happened to be the person in the right position to do it. But she also thought about the families 40 miles east, the children she'd never met who would go into next winter with no Maeve Callahan in their valley, no one who'd spent years at the creek learning what the land could offer when everything else failed. "Yes," she said, "when the road's clear enough, yes." Spring came the way spring comes after a hard winter. Not triumphant, just inevitable. The creek broke in the first week of April, the ice releasing in chunks that moved downstream with a sound like low, continuous thunder. The fields that had been stripped in October were still stripped, but the soil under the snow was richer than anyone had expected. The beetle devastation had turned in some complicated way into a form of churning that the valley's farmers were going to have to think about differently. Thomas Riley said as much at the mill gathering in late April. He said it in the measured, public way that Thomas did things, standing with his hat in his hands and choosing his words. And what he said was that the valley needed to rethink how it prepared. That the crop failure had exposed something they should have known and didn't. That a settlement with only one strategy for feeding itself was a settlement that was one bad season away from collapse, and Red Briar Crossing had just learned that firsthand, and the question now was whether they were going to act on what they'd learned or wait until the next time. It was not a speech that mentioned Maeve by name, but it was shaped entirely by what she had done, and everyone in the room understood that. Walt Ames stood up after Thomas sat down. Walt was not a speaker. He was visibly uncomfortable standing in front of people, his hat turning in his hands the same way Thomas's had, some Red Briar Crossing habit of the nervous. He said that his sons had learned more useful things from the creek sessions than they'd learned in 2 years of following him around the fields, and that he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that information, but he thought it needed to be said. He sat down quickly. Carol, beside him, looked straight ahead with the careful neutrality of a woman not going to acknowledge publicly that she'd been right all along. Silas did not stand up and make a speech. Silas was not that man, and never would be. But he was in the room, sitting beside his wife, which was its own statement in a small settlement where people read presence and absence like text. Maeve sat in the room and listened and felt something that was not quite what she'd have expected to feel. She'd have expected satisfaction, maybe vindication, the clean feeling of having been proven right. What she actually felt was more complicated and less comfortable, because she looked around the room and saw the faces of people who had let her work in isolation for years, who had laughed, who had gone quiet during the worst of it. And she felt all of that alongside the warmth, tangled together in the way real feelings usually are. It was not a clean emotion. It was just true. After the gathering, she was walking back to the road when Frederick Crowley appeared at her elbow. Edith's 10-year-old, the one who had come home knowing 3 plants and been met with a sharpness his mother now visibly regretted. "Mrs. Mercer," he said seriously. She looked down at him. "Frederick, my mother says you're going to travel to other settlements in the summer to teach people what you know." "That's the plan." He considered this with the gravity of a child weighing something important. "Can I come?" She looked at him. This serious-faced boy who had learned plant identification from Lucy Heller at a children's gathering and had retained it with an enthusiasm that had apparently been the beginning of his mother's undoing. "How old are you?" 10.5. "Ask your mother," she said. "If she says yes, talk to me in June." He nodded with the solemnity of someone sealing an agreement. Then he ran back toward where Edith was waiting on the other side of the road. Maeve watched him go. Edith caught her eye across the distance, brief, complicated, containing everything they'd said in the road in February and the 6 Tuesdays before that, and the crow on the porch, and the bundle on the railing, and the year that had passed between them. Then she took her son's hand and turned toward home. On the morning Maeve left for Dorset Fork, the first settlement on her route, 12 miles east, she came down to the creek one more time, alone before anyone else was awake, with her pack already loaded by the door of the house. It was early May. The creek was running full and fast, snowmelt still pushing the current higher than its summer level, the water clear and cold over the stones. The wild things were coming back along the banks, new lambs' quarters pushing up through the mud, watercress already dense in the shallow runs, the first elderberry leaves barely open on the old bushes she'd been harvesting for years. She crouched at the bank and stayed there for a while. Not gathering, not working, just being at the water the way she had been for years before anyone thought to come with her. She thought about what it costs to be the person who pays attention when everyone around you has decided that the thing you're paying attention to doesn't matter. She thought about the specific loneliness of that, not dramatic loneliness, not the kind that makes for good storytelling, but the quiet, grinding kind that just accumulates over years of being told, implicitly and explicitly, that the way you see things is wrong. She had carried that weight for a long time. She was still carrying some of it. It didn't go away because things had shifted. Damage doesn't evaporate with resolution. It just becomes part of the ground you stand on. But she also thought about Lucy Heller's 2 notebooks, about Willa Peters talking for 3 hours in her kitchen about the North Slope without stopping, the words coming out like they'd been waiting for someone to ask, about Walt Ames's 16-year-old identifying 8 species with that fierce, surprised look on his face when someone told him he was good at something, about Frederick Crowley's hand in his mother's running across a road, about Silas at the kitchen table with his head down and his hand moving, careful and slow. The things she'd built were in people now, not on shelves, not in jars, not in notebooks, though it was in those too, and the notebooks mattered, but mostly it was in people. It was in the hands of women who had crouched on a creek bank in November and learned something they would never unknow. It was in the questions children asked now when they walked near the tree line or the creek. Not what is that in the dismissive sense, but what is that in the sense of genuine wanting to know. It was in the way the settlement had started to look at the land around it differently, not as backdrop, not as threat, but as something that could be understood if you were willing to get quiet enough and patient enough to try. That was the thing Maeve had always known and struggled to articulate. The land was not separate from them. The creek didn't care what people thought of her, yes, but the creek also sustained them, had always sustained them, would sustain their children if their children learned to look. The dismissal of that knowledge wasn't just a personal slight to Maeve. It was a community choosing blindness in a place where sight could save them, and the cost of that blindness was paid in hard winters and stripped fields and children with hollow faces. She didn't think any of this in a grand or oratorical way. She thought it the way people think things at creek banks in the early morning, not in complete sentences, more in images and feelings, and the kind of knowing that sits below language. She stood up. Her knees hurt, the way they always hurt in cold mornings, the way they were going to hurt for the rest of her life probably. She picked up a handful of watercress from the shallows and put it in her coat pocket because it seemed wrong to leave without taking something. Then she walked back up the ridge path toward the house and the packed bag and the road east. Silas was in the kitchen when she came in. He had coffee made and bread cut, which was more than she'd expected. He was wearing the expression he wore when he was doing something and didn't want to make a thing of it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed and handed her the coffee. She drank it standing. He stood across the table and watched her with the look he'd been wearing more frequently lately, the recalibrated look, the one that had replaced the careful avoidance of the middle years. It was not a perfect marriage. It had never been a perfect marriage. They were not people designed to be easy on each other, and 8 years had accumulated its share of things that would never fully resolve. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it had survived something that might have ended it. "How long?" he said. 6 weeks, maybe 8. It depends on what I find at Dorset Fork and how much time they need." He nodded. "Write when you can." "I will." He picked up her pack and walked it to the door and held it while she put it on. This was the kind of thing he'd not done in a long time, and she felt the weight of it. Not the pack, the gesture. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you. For the winter. For what you did." He looked like he might say it was nothing, or wave it off. The Silas from before would have done that, filed it under things too uncomfortable to receive directly. This Silas stood with his hand on the door and said simply, "You'd have done it without me." "Probably," she said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." He opened the door. The May morning came in, warm and smelling like mud and green things, and the particular aliveness of a world coming back to itself after a hard season. She walked out into it. That summer, Maeve Callahan traveled to 7 settlements across the frontier region. She carried copies of the guide. Dr. Farrow had arranged for 12 copies to be made by a printer in the county seat, which was a fact that still seemed slightly unreal to her. And she spent between 3 and 10 days in each settlement, teaching anyone who would come and leaving the guide with whoever seemed most likely to keep it alive. She was not welcomed everywhere with open arms. 2 settlements received her with the particular frontier wariness reserved for people who arrive uninvited with unconventional knowledge. One man at a place called Three Forks told her to her face that he didn't see the use of what she was selling, which she wasn't selling, and she thanked him for his time and went to find the women of the settlement, who were considerably more interested. She was not transformed by the journey into someone she wasn't. She was still herself, impatient with foolishness, physically uncomfortable in ways she'd long stopped apologizing for, prone to lying awake at night in unfamiliar beds running through conversations she should have had differently. She lost her temper once at Dorset Fork when a man talked over her during a demonstration, and she told him, flatly and in front of everyone, that if he knew more than she did about this, he was welcome to run the session and she'd take a seat. He didn't take her up on it. She continued the session. She came home in late September to a valley that had spent the summer preparing differently than it ever had before. 3 families had planted lamb's quarters alongside their corn. The creek bank had, for the first time, been divided into informal management sections, different families responsible for different stretches, making sure things weren't overharvested. Lucy Heller had started holding sessions for the settlement's children on Saturday mornings, which she ran with a quiet authority that was almost alarming in a 9-year-old, except that she was almost 10 by then, and it suited her perfectly. Willa Peters had, at some point over the summer, started coming into the main settlement more often. Nobody made much of this, which was probably the right approach. She showed up at the mill sometimes and occasionally at the creek sessions, and she and Francis Morrow had apparently struck up something that couldn't quite be called a friendship, but involved regular exchanges of seeds and long silences on each other's porches, which at 70-something might be the same thing. Edith Crowley ran the Tuesday sessions while Maeve was traveling. Nobody had asked her to. She had simply shown up the first Tuesday after Maeve left and organized what needed organizing, and had done it every Tuesday through July and August. When Maeve came back and heard this from Ruth, she stood very still for a moment. She didn't change what you'd taught, Ruth said. She added 3 things from her own observations. All 3 were correct. A pause. I checked. Maeve breathed out. Of course you did. Of course I did. The following spring, a settler's wife from a community 3 days' ride east came to Redbriar Crossing, specifically looking for Maeve. Her name was Agnes Proctor, and she had a copy of the guide, worn, with her own annotations filling the margins. And she had questions that went beyond what the guide answered. They spent 4 days together. Maeve taught, and Agnes asked questions and pushed back on things she disagreed with, which Maeve found refreshing rather than irritating, because she was right about 2 of them. Maeve added those corrections to her own copy of the guide with a note attributing them to Agnes Proctor of Miller's Creek because credit mattered and because she'd spent enough years being the person whose knowledge was used without acknowledgement. On Agnes's last morning, they were at the creek bank in the early light when Agnes said, "How does it feel, knowing what you started?" Maeve thought about it, honestly, the way she did most things. "It doesn't feel like I started something," she said. "It feels like I kept doing what I'd been doing long enough that other people had time to catch up." Agnes looked at her. "That's a modest answer." "It's not modest," Maeve said. "It's just accurate. The knowledge was always here. The land was always here. I didn't create any of it. I just paid attention." "Someone had to." "Yes," Maeve said. "Someone always has to." They stayed at the bank for a while after that, watching the water. The creek was running fast and clear with spring melt, the same water that had run past this bank for as long as anyone alive could remember, before Redbriar Crossing existed, before any of them had names for the things growing along its edges. It occurred to Maeve that this was the thing people most consistently underestimated. Not her specifically, but the kind of attention she practiced. The world was full of people who were good at loud things, visible things, the things that got talked about at mill gatherings and written down in county records. The world had always needed those people and would continue to need them. But it also needed the people who crouched at creek banks in the early morning and paid attention to what was missing, who noticed the absent frogs and the wrong-moving birds and the untouched weeds, and understood that the land was trying to tell them something, who kept that knowledge alive through years when nobody asked for it, in notebooks on shelves that nobody looked at, because they understood, even if they couldn't have told you why, that the day would come when somebody needed to know. The woman who had been mocked for 11 years for wandering in the mud with a basket full of weeds had fed 60 families through a winter that should have broken them. She had put knowledge in the hands of children who would carry it for the rest of their lives. She had begun something that had moved east and would keep moving. She had done it without being thanked for most of it. She had done it while being threatened and doubted and dismissed. She had done it because it was necessary and because she was the one who could see it. And those two facts were sufficient. That was the whole of it. There was no larger logic, no arc of destiny, no story in which the universe arranged itself to reward the right people. There was just a woman who paid attention when it was thankless and kept paying attention when it became useful and never confused the two states as being fundamentally different from each other. The creek ran on. The lamb's quarters pushed up green and new along the bank. Somewhere upstream, a bird called once, the first red-winged blackbird of the season, back from wherever they'd been. Maeve heard it, filed it, added a note in the margin of the day. The world kept going, which was what it did. And she kept watching, which was what she did. Some things are exactly that simple and exactly that hard.